The sprawling mansion sat silent under the soft gold of the afternoon sun, its marble floors polished perfection, its walls echoing the quiet of privilege. For years, it had been a place of order, rules, and routines. Each room run like clockwork, each moment dictated by wealth and status. But that day, something was different. Billionaire Charles Whitmore wasn't supposed to be home. His private jet had landed 2 hours earlier than expected after a business deal in London fell through. The driver had dropped him off quietly, and Charles, tired but restless, had entered his mansion without the usual entourage. He wanted silence, a glass of whiskey, solitude, and maybe a call to his assistant to reschedule meetings. But as he stepped deeper into his home, he heard something unusual. It wasn't the hum of the cleaning vacuum or the distant ring of his phone. It was a voice. Soft, gentle, melodic, a woman's voice. He followed the sound down the hall to his study, the one room his staff knew was off-limits. Yet there it was, light laughter, followed by the small, confident voice of his 7-year-old son, Noah, and then he froze. Inside, sitting cross-legged beside the mahogany desk, was a family's maid, Elena Brooks, a black woman in her early 40s, wearing her modest uniform, her hair tied back neatly. But she wasn't cleaning. She was teaching. Noah was perched beside her, reading from a thick book, his tiny fingers tracing words that Charles himself never thought the boy would read this soon. For a long moment, Charles stood there, hidden behind the doorframe, watching in disbelief. Why was his maid teaching his son? And why did Noah look so happy? That one quiet, stolen moment would unravel everything Charles thought he knew about privilege, race, and what truly made a person worthy. Charles Whitmore was a man who had built empires. The founder of one of New York's largest investment firms. He had climbed his way up through sharp intellect, ruthless strategy, and the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. His name was synonymous with power. His mansion, perched on the edge of the Hudson River, stood as proof of his triumph. 15 bedrooms, 7 fireplaces, and walls lined with art worth millions. He had everything except time. His wife, Margaret, was more of a fixture than a partner. Their marriage had been transactional for years, bound by appearances and convenience. Their son, Noah, was raised more by tutors and caretakers than his own parents. Elena Brooks had joined their staff 2 years earlier. She was quiet, efficient, and always on time. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, addressing everyone with sir or ma'am. Charles barely noticed her at first. She was part of the house's rhythm, blending into the background like furniture. What he didn't know was that Elena's story was nothing like the rest of his staff. Before cleaning houses, she'd been a teacher, a gifted one, but a budget cut, a change in district leadership, and the color of her skin had cost her everything. Despite holding 2 degrees in education, she had been overlooked time and again. Eventually, bills piled up, and she took what work she could find. The Whitmore mansion became her livelihood. Still, something inside her refused to fade. Each time she dusted the bookshelves in Charles's study, her eyes lingered on the titles: Shakespeare, Baldwin, Douglas, history, philosophy. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of education Noah, a bright but lonely boy, was truly receiving. It started small. One afternoon, Noah had asked her what she was humming. It was a lullaby her grandmother had sung when she was a child. The next day, he asked her what she was reading during her lunch break, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Then one day, when his private tutor canceled, Noah had brought his homework to her. "Miss Elena, can you help me with this?" She had hesitated, knowing her boundaries. But one look at the boy's frustrated face, and her instincts took over. She sat beside him, guiding him through the lesson gently, with patience as other tutors lacked. It became a quiet ritual. When no one else was around, Elena would help Noah read, write, and understand stories that reached far beyond his classroom. He began to light up in ways his father had never seen. Charles didn't interrupt him right away. He stood there, half hidden, watching. The way Noah smiled as Elena encouraged him. The way she explained complex words with warmth instead of impatience. It was unsettling. Finally, he stepped in, clearing his throat. The moment shattered like glass. Elena sprang to her feet, stammering apologies, her eyes wide with fear. Noah, confused, looked between them. "Mr. Whitmore, I was just," she began, but Charles's tone cut sharp. "I don't pay you to teach. Elena, you're here to clean." Her mouth trembled as she tried to explain, but the weight of his words silenced her. Noah tugged at his father's sleeve, trying to speak up, but Charles dismissed him gently. Later that night, as he poured himself a drink, his mind couldn't let go of what he'd seen. Something about the scene, the connection, the care, gnawed at him. He hadn't seen his son so engaged in months, but his pride resisted. How could a woman like her, someone he barely noticed, have more influence over his child than the expensive tutors he hired? That thought festered overnight. The next morning, he called Elena into his office. She stood before him, hands clasped, shoulders straight despite her fear. He asked her to explain. She told him everything: the canceled lessons, the boy's curiosity, her background as a teacher. She didn't beg for forgiveness, only understanding. But Charles didn't want to hear it. The idea that his maid, a black woman, had stepped beyond her role bruised his ego in ways he couldn't admit. By the end of the conversation, he'd made up his mind. He fired her. Elena thanked him quietly, tears in her eyes, and left without another word. Noah cried for hours. Days passed, and the mansion fell back into silence. But something had changed. Noah's laughter vanished. His grades dropped. Even his teachers noticed he'd lost focus. Then one evening, Charles found something on his desk, an old, worn notebook. Inside, in neat handwriting, were notes, lessons, and quotes about courage, equality, and the power of education. At the bottom of one page, written in a child handwriting, were the words, "Miss Elena says people who make others feel small forget that kindness is strength." It hit him harder than any business loss ever had. Charles couldn't shake it off. He started asking around, trying to understand who Elena really was. The house manager told him she'd once been a school teacher, a brilliant one. She'd worked in an underfunded district where she'd started free after-school programs for disadvantaged kids. Her students adored her. Then, after the school's budget cuts, she was replaced by someone more connected. He found out she lived in a small apartment downtown, barely making ends meet. And yet, she volunteered twice a week at a literacy center for kids who couldn't afford tutoring. That revelation cracked something in him. Driven by guilt and curiosity, Charles drove to the community center one afternoon. There she was, standing in front of a group of children, reading aloud from The Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois, her voice steady and warm. The kids were mesmerized. He stood there unseen again, just as he had the first day. But this time, his silence came from awe, not judgment. After the session, he approached her. She was startled but composed. He didn't come to apologize with words. Instead, he offered something unexpected, a donation to the center, not as a show of wealth, but as a start. Over the following weeks, he kept returning. Sometimes he'd bring Noah along. Slowly, the barriers began to crumble. For the first time, Charles listened not just to Elena, but to what her story represented. The countless voices silenced by systems of inequality, the potential wasted because of prejudice. And when Noah once again sat beside Elena, reading out loud, Charles didn't see a maid teaching his son. He saw a teacher restoring something that wealth could never buy: compassion. Months later, the Whitmore mansion felt different. The atmosphere was softer, filled with laughter and learning instead of formality. Elena had been rehired, not as a maid, but as Noah's personal tutor. Charles and Margaret began funding scholarships at Elena's Literacy Center, naming the initiative the Brooks Foundation for Equal Education. For Charles, the transformation went deeper than money. He began to question his own beliefs, the unspoken hierarchies he'd lived by all his life. He'd always thought success was measured by what a man could buy. But Elena had shown him something priceless: the ability to lift others up. Noah flourished. He became kinder, more aware, more curious about the world. When asked who his favorite teacher was, he didn't say Miss Brooks. He said, "My friend Elena." As for Elena, she remained humble, continuing her mission to educate those forgotten by privilege. Her story became a quiet testament, That greatness doesn't always wear a suit or live in a mansion. Sometimes it wears a cleaning uniform and carries wisdom deeper than any fortune could hold. One evening, Charles stood in his study, the same room where it all began. He watched as Elena and Noah laughed over a book. The image filled him with gratitude and shame for how blind he'd been. The world outside might still measure people by status and color, but within those walls, things had changed. A man who once looked down had learned to look within. And all because one woman dared to teach, not just a boy, but a billionaire, the true meaning of education.